This week on The Futurist, Brett King is in the hot seat.
There's one element that you will see repeatedly in human history is that we tend to not plan very well for these things. The crises have to be on us and debilitating for us to respond. But the scale of artificial intelligence and climate in respect to the changes they're going to bring on society are so large that any delay in response to this and any complacency, as you say, is going to cost lives and trillions of dollars.
Technology, as all your listeners will be aware of because they interact with it on a daily basis, emancipates you from the drudgery of tasks that one didn't want to do in the past, maybe doesn't want to do in the future and won't need to. It's a force for good in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that equality is going to disappear, but it does mean that more people are going to have access to greater resources and a better quality of life.
Hello, welcome to The Future. I'm Rob Tercek, and this week we've got something special for you. My co-host, Brett King, will be in the hot seat answering questions with his co-author on their new book, Technosocialism. Hey, Brett, welcome to The Future.
It's great to be back in the future with you, Robert.
Spend almost
I like
all your
living
time
in
there.
the future. Yeah. This is an unusual one where I'm on the other side of the microphone, if you like, where you're asking the questions. But,
That's right.
Great to.
I'll do my best to make it as uncomfortable as possible for you. To get started,
Great.
let's talk a little bit about your co-author. So this time, you've written a number of books, and if for folks who don't know, Brett's written several books, particularly the Bank series, the Future Banking series, which are superb. But this time, Brett's worked with a co-author, Dr. Richard Petty, who is a global policy advisor who's worked all over the world, including in China. We'll get into that in a moment. He's also an entrepreneur, a best-selling author, and an academic. Now, Brett, what attracted you to work with Richard Petty on this book?
His hairstyle.
Oh,
Really? No. No, Richard and I have known each other for more than 20 years now. We worked together in Hong Kong. And around the world, actually, we had businesses in China and Dubai and elsewhere that we worked on together. So we'd known each other for quite a while, and we'd been looking for a project to do together. And this ended up being something we incubated for a number of years. We talked about it, and it just slowly took shape. I think what really sort of kicked this off is we ended up getting together in Sydney at one point. We both happened to be there, and we got into a boardroom with a whiteboard, and I think spent 4 or 5 hours in front of a whiteboard just mapping some ideas out, and the book was sort of born out of that. Now, we did have some things we talked about prior to that, but that was the kickoff. And at that point, it was sort of the melding of the minds, and we knew each other so well that was fairly effortless, to put the book together after that. But yeah, we'd been looking for something to do together. Like this.
Well, we'll get into your process and we'll get into the scenarios in just a second. But Val, I think it's a good time for us to introduce Richard. Richard, welcome to The Futurists. It's great to have you here. This is a show where we talk to people who are thinking about and actually actively building the future. And what we're most interested in is, how did you arrive at your vision of the future? What was your methodology for arriving at that? And what are you doing about that to implement it? Those are the questions that we like. So welcome, Richard, to the show.
Thank you, Rob. Hi, Brett.
What I'm interested in talking to you about is the core premise of the book. So, Richard, share with me a little bit about the perspectives that you brought to technosocialism.
Well, Brett and I spent a lot of time talking about the various ideas in the book and how they take form and how they might take dimension in terms of different chapters. And we arrived at the core themes because they're universal, and hopefully because they're universal, they're applicable and of interest to everybody. I think Brett's background is banking and technology, a whole range of things. Mm-hmm. But if I were to narrow it down, a future of tech, future of technology broadly, and banking. And my background is in finance and economics and accounting and business. and as an academic. So I think we blended the two, hopefully fairly successfully, to produce a book that's of interest.
Well, the book is actually a very good book. I told Brett it's the best book of his that I've read. So clearly your contribution made a big difference. What's interesting about the book and why it's relevant to the show is it's not just a shameless plug for my buddy's book. Not at all. In fact, while Brett was writing the book is when we came up with the idea for the show, because the subject matter of the book is really, really relevant to what we're trying to do on the Futurists. Namely, it's helping people understand what's coming next, what's likely to occur in the near future and why that's likely to occur, and what to do about it now so that you can be prepared. These are really two themes that are true in Technosocialism, the book, and they're also part of what we hope to build here at the Futurists. No, so you two seem to have, as part of your methodology, first, you've worked together in many places in the world. And I think that's a really important thing for people to take away from the show. People who are thinking about the future tend to get out and look around the world. It's a bit like that old adage that I know Brett likes to quote, the idea that the future's already here. It's just unevenly distributed. That's a William Gibson quote, and it's a good one. It's relevant. It's actually true. You know, I've seen that myself from working in Asia and Europe as much as I possibly can. I think it's important to get out there. So you do have that in common. But in addition, you're multidisciplinary. And so while Brett has a focus on finance and technology and the intersection of the two, you bring other perspectives from economics and so forth into it. And that mixture then allows you to kind of compare and contrast some perspectives. So for the folks who are listening, that right there is a key point. That is part of the methodology of creating this book, Technosocialism. Brett, why don't you tell me in a nutshell, what's the theme of the book? What's the book about?
Well, so if you look at the subtitle, it says The Rise of Technosocialism, How Inequality, AI, and Climate Change Will Usher in a New World, right? And so it's very much a philosophical conversation about how humanity will adapt to these forces. Obviously, inequality is a massive problem right now and has become a much more significant problem as a result of the pandemic. The gap between the rich and the poor has grown globally. The number of people, for the first time in 100 years, we've seen people slip back into poverty. This is a trend over 100 years that we'd been, that we sort of got on top of. But the other issues are clearly how humanity is going to adapt to a world where we have highly automated societies and the changing role of work and human capital in those societies. And of course, our response to climate change and the resources and effort that that's going to take on a global basis and the cooperation it's going to need. Any one of these three things would be considered a crisis historically in respect to how humanity is going to have to respond to that. So we wanted to sort of really map out what are the potential ways we're going to have to deal, or what are the ways humanity might respond to that, and put an argument forward for what we thought was the optimal way that humanity could respond to those changes. But one thing I noticed is you just mentioned three of the big drivers of your scenarios. Right. You described them, you characterized them as crises, right? So climate change, global inequality or income inequality, and the rise of artificial intelligence. Now, I would submit to you that quite a few people are very complacent about this. They don't see it as a crisis at all. And many people deny climate change. At least, many people in the United States seem to deny that it's even a factor. Inequality, although it is a great matter of great concern, many people are not concerned about it. They're not reacting to it. We're certainly not taking measures to do anything to rectify that or redistribute income in any meaningful way. And then with the rise of artificial intelligence, I think the mass group of people right now is fairly indifferent to it, and maybe even unaware of it. Correct me if I got that wrong.
No, I think you're broadly right, Rob. Most people, I believe, would be familiar with the ideas. They'd hear about it in the ether. It would be background noise, but very few people are dealing with the issues directly. I would say climate change aside, because it's been such a focus in mainstream media for a long time. But if you look at wealth and income inequality and AI and even the digital economy, these concepts are very important and prevalent already in some sectors, but they're not widely distributed through the economy in a way where many people are engaging with the ideas on a daily basis and being confronted by them and what they mean. And the issue we have really is just how quickly the forces that are shaping the world have been accelerating. So I have conversations regularly with people where they say things like, well, post-industrialization, post-war, baby boomer, look at the time frame taken for major change there, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, these various things happen, whatever examples they cite. So we've got, 30 years, 40 years looking into the future based on the past to think about what might be happening. That's just not true. What's happening is the time compression, the spatial compression means that the forces that we're seeing today are shaping things far more rapidly. So the changes, take central bank digital currency as one example in China. Talk about a trial in 2018, and it's here that could be given.
Okay, so one thing you're saying is that these three big forces, in a way, they reinforce and accelerate each other. And I think that's quite true. For instance, artificial intelligence, though it brings great opportunities for those who are deploying it, it also means a lot of people are going to be displaced from their jobs. And that's going to, at least in the short term, exacerbate income inequality. And we could say the same about climate change. If most people sleepwalk through climate change until there's a fire in their neighborhood or until it's like super snowy and freezing cold, but then, the weather goes away and after a time we sort of slip back into complacency. But those disruptions in the climate are also going to have an effect, I think, on inequality. And so you can start to see those big three factors influencing each other in some respects, accelerating what might become a mega crisis. Is that your premise? Is that how you see this? Is that why you felt it was so urgent to write this book?
I think there's one element that you will see repeatedly in human history is that we tend to not plan very well for these things. The crises have to be on us and debilitating for us to respond.
Right.
But the scale of artificial intelligence and climate in respect to the changes they're going to bring on society are so large that any delay in response to this and any complacency, as you say, is going to cost lives and trillions of dollars.
And the best illustration of that is the pandemic that we just had. And this is, many people acted like, wow, nobody could have foreseen this. No one could have possibly imagined that there would be a new kind of coronavirus that would come out of the Wuhan district from perhaps a bat. When in fact, that very scenario had been predicted dozens and dozens of times by expert scientists, just no one was listening to them.
And the inequality, all of these crises produce economic uncertainty. That's the premise in the book. But
that's right.
The inequality issue, when we've seen the levels of inequality that we have today, when we've seen these in the past, it has always been a precursor for revolution. That's how serious the level of inequality we have today is. And you can see, as we discuss in the book, that the number of protests globally and the participation in protests globally has increased significantly, more than doubled in terms of frequency and a tenfold increase in terms of participation volume of protesters. So that gives you the indication that what's happened in the past with inequality producing revolution, we've got all of the potential ingredients for that happening in many countries around the world today because of inequality alone. That's even before we get into the unemployment potential of automation and the broader impact of climate.
So given all of those trends and those scary factors that are causing so much, let's say, disruption or uncertainty, big theme in your book, you propose that the solution, the antidote to all this, is a form of socialism. Now, here in the U.S., those are fighting words. When we talk about socialism in the United States, it's basically a catch-all phrase for something that I don't like very much. And it's thrown around by various political figures who I think aren't very well informed. How accurately are you using this term socialism? What's your definition of socialism and technosocialism?
Well, neither Brett nor I are socialists. We should say that up front. We're both raised in capitalist economies with capitalist views and ideals.
So I'm not talking to a modern day Frederick Engels and Karl Marx here, proposing some sort of red-shirted revolution.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So the title is perhaps interesting and maybe there to help stimulate interest, but in specific terms, it goes to equality of a kind that isn't what socialism of the past would presage or advocate for, but it's a broader quality. And it's a broader quality that technology brings about and technology enables. Technology, as all your listeners will be aware of because they interact with it on a daily basis, emancipates you from the drudgery of tasks that one didn't want to do in the past, maybe doesn't want to do in the future and won't need to. So it's a force for good in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that income and wealth inequality is going to disappear, but it does mean that more people are going to have access to greater resources and a better quality of life. So this is what the technology is enabling.
Now, the classical socialism envisioned the notion that the workers will own the means of production, right? Famously, and that's both Bakunin and Karl Marx writing in the 1870s. And to a certain extent, in digital media, that's true. In this creator economy, now everybody has a supercomputer in their pocket, a smartphone, and they are able to contribute. So one aspect of equality, Richard, is access, right? Equal access. There's a lot of ways to define equality, but historically, that's always been an issue in most countries, that not everybody has equal access to opportunity. One might say that digital media does level a playing field, at least somewhat. And the fact that everybody with a smartphone now can participate in the creator economy, would you point to that as a form of techno-socialism?
So let me jump in here. Yes, absolutely. I think what we advocate in the book, and Richard came up with this great concept, which was that the economy should serve the citizens first and foremost. So rather than the workers owning the means of production, that it's like the citizens should own the outcome of the economy. And so if you look at alignment of how economic output works today in the systems we have today, it's geared towards a very small subsection of the community at large, or the citizens. Whereas if you repurpose the economy to focus on the core needs of citizens first and foremost, and you do that with technology, two things happen. You get much better at looking after the core needs of citizens, and over the period of time, within just a couple of decades, you can reduce the cost of government and all of those services to citizens dramatically. So it's like socialism, but without the cost. In fact, cheaper than the cost of the current system today. We demonstrate in the book, for example, on healthcare, how you can lower the cost of the national healthcare system in the United States by 70%, 70%. From the system today, using automation of that system.
Great. Okay, so we're talking about two things then. One is equality of access to opportunity, and what Brett you just spoke about is equality of outcome. Basically divvying up the pie. We know that there's some prosperity there, but it's not equally distributed. So that's another way to go about doing it. In the second half of this program, what I'd love to do is get into the 4 different scenarios that you posit for the future, and tell me how you arrived at those scenarios, and then tell me why you chose techno-socialism as the most favorable outcome. So right now I'm talking to Dr. Richard Petty and my co-host, Brett King. They are the co-authors of The Rise of Technosocialism, one of the best books on the topic of the near future that I've read, and part of that is because it's so well informed by data. As Brett and Richard just pointed out, they meticulously document every scenario, every claim that's in the book with factual information. So in the second half, after the break, we're going to come back and talk about some of the core parts of what's inside the prescription for the future. You're listening to The Futurists. See you in a moment.
Welcome to Breaking Banks, the #1 global fintech radio show and podcast. I'm Brett King.
And I'm Jason Henricks. Every week since 2013, we explore the personalities, startups, innovators, and industry players driving disruption in financial services.
From incumbents to unicorns, and from cutting-edge technology to the people using it to help create a more innovative, inclusive, and healthy financial future. I'm JP Nichols, and this is Breaking Banks.
Hey, welcome back to The Futurist. I'm Rob Tercek, and today I'm interviewing my co-host, Brett King, and his co-author, Richard Petty, Dr. Richard Petty, about their new book, Technosocialism. Now, Brett, one of the core premises in the book is scenarios. And that's also really relevant to our show. That's why you're on the show today. You posit 4 scenarios for the future of humanity. Can you tell us about those 4 scenarios?
So we come up with 4 scenarios. They are the Luddistan scenario, the Failedistan scenario, Neo-Feudalism, and Technosocialism. And those quadrants on a 2x2 representation of 2 primary axes. One is societies that are inclusive versus exclusionary, and futures that are optimal or planned versus futures that are chaotic. And so on the chaotic side, you have on the inclusive side is where we say technology creates division. So we reject technology like artificial intelligence. So that's the inclusive chaotic. On the exclusionary chaotic, you have the failed states where we just waited too long to react to some of these core problems. And, as a result, you have failed states.
In a way, that's kind of the default path that we're on. If we just do nothing and we sort of sit back and go, yeah, AI, climate change, whatever, we're not doing a thing about it, then we end up in Failedistan.
Exactly. And then on the planned futures, you have exclusionary economies like the United States, where we said neo-feudalism is essentially where we're heading today, which is where the gap between rich and poor gets baked in systemically. So the stratification of wealth in society is sort of baked in by market mechanisms, and by the way, society responds. And then the inclusionary technology-based, planned outcomes is where we look at, reducing the cost of government, making technology accessible to everyone. So for things like better healthcare, better access to education, better transportation systems, access to food, shelter, all those sort of things, that we use technology to ensure that the best quality of those capabilities are delivered across the economy. Okay, so that's the 4 quadrants.
Those are the 4 quadrants. So for those who are listening, if we do nothing, we end up in Failedistan, basically the land of failure, where these big trends, these big disruptors, are going to overwhelm our systems. Another alternative, which is also kind of a failure, is neo-feudalism, and that's where the rich do something about it. They start to build walled cities with private police and so forth, and they leave everybody else behind. So we have a scenario of massive inequality. Luddistan is a scenario of chaos where people reject technology altogether, and we are unable, therefore, to harness it to improve life, and things begin to degrade. So from the viewpoint of this book, the only scenario that makes sense is technosocialism. Technosocialism relies on technology, but with planning and foresight. That's what brings it to the relevance of our listeners here. Now, I would say planned economy is a loaded term. Certainly here in the United States, where we've had 50 years of neoconservatism and the idea that the government should be hands-off, in particular on the technology industry, where we barely regulate anything anymore in the United States. That seems like it's quite opposed to the national trend in the U.S. That may be different elsewhere, and I know that you're both Australian. Tell me a little bit about that, though. How likely is it that we're going to see, government policy or some sort of industrial policy?
Well, when we talk about government policy, I think it's important to understand there's a real bifurcation on the global stage among governments and thinking about regulation and policy. So some economies, I would suggest, are over-regulated and continue heading in that direction, and other economies are very focused and perhaps regulated in a more sensible way. Ultimately, this needs to lead to productivity. That's something we argue in the book. If it doesn't result in productivity, then it's going to stymie innovation, kill the knowledge economy, or under-realize the potential that's there. So government needs to work hand in hand with business. I think the policy prescriptions that the government puts out need to be informed by business, but quickly, really nimbly, and it needs to be an effective compact rather than just shutting business down, which many businesses would argue feels like it's so often the case.
Now, where do you see that happening? Is there any place in the world where you'd point to a national government that's actually doing a good job of working hand in hand with business to set intelligent policies?
I think if you look at the examples of smart cities that we give in the book, and perhaps a good example there is Singapore working hand in hand with business to create smart city developments and to look at new economy initiatives. If you look at what Singapore's done with Digital Hub and what they've done with education, education being such a key and core industry to knowledge, innovation and creativity, which is the backbone of the future economy. Now, Singapore is not perfect, of course. There are many ways in which Singapore might be argued to be over-regulating or overly intrusive, but to a large degree, they get it right in a lot of areas in terms of improving productivity and supporting industry. So I think that's a fair example. It happens in the US, in parts of the US, but not in the US overall, and possibly because in the US there are so many other distractions and so much political infighting and fractiousness that just doesn't help the cause. It doesn't help anyone's cause ultimately.
And in the U.S., the states pursue their own policies.
Yeah, correct. So it's very much a state-by-state success fail scorecard in many industries. So the States is an interesting case study for that reason.
Now, Singapore has often been admired by other parts of Asia, other nations in Asia. It's often looked at as a model. When I lived in Hong Kong, there was a very healthy rivalry between Hong Kong and Singapore. But Singapore was viewed also, though, as a little bit of an exception in the sense that it's a small island country with only 6 million residents. And because it doesn't really control any resources of its own, it had to focus on certain industries where they could be competitive. And they also focus very much on diplomacy and good relationships with their neighbors because they're a small country in the middle of some very big countries. Now, China in general, over the last 20 years, has observed the Singapore phenomenon and in some ways has tried to replicate it. First, I know there was an initiative in Singapore nearly 20 years ago to actually work with the Singapore government to try to replicate some aspects of governance in Shanghai. And what you see in China is, an attempt to create a benevolent dictatorship similar to Singapore, where it's a dictatorship that decrees things that are kind of in favor of the people. We've seen recently that President Xi in China is doing some of this. There's been a real crackdown on technology companies, and particularly the excessive technologies, and a shifting over to more scientific industry, like core science, the manufacturing industries, things like chips and renewable energy, solar panels, and so forth. Can you talk a little bit about the contrast with between China and Singapore?
So I think the one thing that's clear that China is doing in terms of its prosperity doctrine is looking at this problem of inequality and the potential for, we saw the tech giants particularly, start to get huge amounts of power in the economy. And, recently they've sort of pulled back on that. But the interesting thing is, you could probably characterize China's economy as less regulation when it came to a lot of the technology initiatives, particularly, for example, the Alibaba, Ant Group, Tencent, these businesses, just on the areas of like mobile wallet and mobile banking innovation that's happened. A lot of that occurred at a sort of breakneck speed without any real regulation. But as soon as it started to look like it could turn negative or result in issues, then the Chinese government stepped in. So the real core thing we focus on, though, in the book is the fact that China as an economy is preparing its nation for the types of skill sets that are going to be needed in the 21st century. And it appears they're doing a better job of that than the US. In the US, we still hear arguments about traditional industries supporting big coal and, so forth. Was a part of Donald Trump's campaign. Whereas, China last year deployed more solar in a single year than the entire solar installation base of the United States the last 40 years. In addition, they teach artificial intelligence at almost every element of the education system today. And for every one PhD STEM graduate that graduates in the US, 3 graduate in China. Then you've got the $8 trillion they're spending on Belt and Road. So all of these things led us to believe and articulate in the book that we think China is going to be a very strong economic player, for the remainder of the century.
You can jump in on your point of contrasting Singapore and China and where the differences are going to lie. So you're exactly right about Singapore. Singapore's had to adapt and innovate, and they've done that very well, and they've succeeded because of it, but they're constrained by a small population and the lack of resources. China isn't. China has massive population, huge access to resources. It's a one-party state, howsoever one might feel about that, but that collectivism leads to and has led to the greatest economic miracle we've seen, where you've lifted hundreds of millions, 600 million people out of poverty and put them into a more modern economy with a lot more quick action to come. So I'd echo what Brett said, and just add to that by, if you look at China's 5-year plan and you look at China 2025 made in China, 2035 standards, China standards, if one looks at Belt and Road, if one looks at the Greater Bay Area initiative, these key policy initiatives, China really has a lot happening that goes to future economy and goes to identifying and carving out a successful future in many ways, we would think.
Now, everything you just mentioned, all those initiatives, Belt and Road, Made in China 2025, these are what we would call industrial policy, where the government sets, industrial goals and then marshals in sort of a way, leads industry to achieving those goals. And China's been very explicit about this. The Chinese government has set forth these goals. They publish them, they update them regularly, and so forth. That's quite different from the United States' approach, which I would characterize as laissez faire, and in a way clueless. Because if you watch our Congress attempt to do an investigation where they interview someone like Mark Zuckerberg or the CEOs of other technology companies, just the nature of the questions that the 70-year-old senators are asking shows that they don't really understand the technologies that they're talking about. And this is a frightening scenario for some people in America, and others cheer it. They say that's what makes America great. The government doesn't get in the way. They leave it free for business to proceed. Why don't you two comment a little bit about those two? And I know I'm generalizing like mad when I make those comments, because what you're really advocating in the book is a more directed approach, a governmental approach, where there is some form of industrial policy. So please comment on that.
Well, it has worked for the US in the past, and the question is, will it work for the US into the future? So laissez-faire works really well when you've got a whole lot of innovation happening and a whole lot of entrepreneurs who are incentivized to produce what they've produced. And in many ways, the US is the leader in many industries and will remain so into the foreseeable future, particularly in areas of technology and social technologies and communication technologies and so on. One could go on and on. So the innovation is there, but will it continue? And to Brett's point about the STEM PhDs, if one looks at how many doctoral students you have in the US versus China, China dwarfs the US in STEM in areas that go to engineering, math, innovation, technology. Mm-hmm. So what sort of future does that predict? But the main issue, I suppose, Rob, the main factor in all of this is coordination. In the US, there just isn't the systematic coordination between government and industry that we see in China. For better or worse, in terms of a political lens, regardless of one how feels about it, coordination works if everyone has a common and clear understanding. So I think your point's very relevant about the gap between the generational gap that perhaps doesn't play into that in a very sensible way for the US and for other economies like it.
And you also need a shared framework and a shared understanding of facts. And I'd submit that that's not always the case in the U.S. in our highly politicized and highly polarized environment right now. Richard, one of the things that you mentioned and you describe in the book, we formulated is an acronym KIC, knowledge, innovation, and creative. And these are some of the ingredients that you think are going to be necessary for industry to respond to these initiatives, to achieve these targets. Tell me more about that plan.
Well, we're already in a knowledge economy, and we have been for some time. The signposts are there, as you discussed during your podcast, for the future economy and what that means. And we'd suggest that it's knowledge, innovation, and creative economy into the future that will survive. So that umbrella brings in all of the jobs, the industries, and then the jobs that are likely to succeed into the future. And it's where the focus should be. for anyone who's looking at the future.
In a way, that might be viewed as like the antidote to artificial intelligence, right? So artificial intelligence is a double-edged sword in some respects, because on the one hand, it offers the path to great prosperity as we can automate more parts of the economy. And clearly that's demonstrably true. The rewards of that, the benefits of that, are not always equally distributed, but nevertheless, AI definitely brings efficiency to the production of goods. At the same time, it also destroys jobs. And this is a fact. And in your book, you cite that widely cited Oxford report where they prognosticate that some 50% of jobs might be displaced by AI. So the knowledge economy, innovation jobs, and jobs that involve creativity, these seem to be less likely to be automated. Brett, you haven't spoken up a little bit, but why don't you respond to that a little bit, this double-edged aspect of artificial intelligence and robotics?
So we can see where this is trending, because if you look at the largest companies today, we identify them in the book. 9 out of 10 of the largest companies in the world today are technology company. The only one that's an exception to that is Saudi Aramco. But of those 9 technology companies that are in the top 10, and I'm not sure if Facebook might have slipped out of that recently, but if you look at the number of people they employ for the economic output those businesses produce, that has been declining over time. It is about 1/5 of the largest employers in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States in terms of that ratio of employees or individuals working, human capital to profitability. So these technology companies are massively more profitable, require a lot less people to accomplish that. We would expect that trend would continue, that corporations would become more and more automated because, humans are one of the most expensive components of labor. Take a business like Uber, for example. When we have autonomous vehicles, we can cut out the cost of human labor. But the more of society we automate in that respect, the more problem we have of having to find jobs that humans can now do that have been replaced by that automation. And that's really at the heart of this question as to, what do we do when we have highly automated societies with these corporations that the market rewards because they're extremely productive and extremely efficient at producing, capital return. What do we do with the humans? And that's a very real question that we sort of did try to tackle in the book. But it's a bigger question of sort of the role of work in society and how we value people in society if they're unable to work because society's taken that option away from them as a result of automation. Ironically, the one saving grace here may be response to climate change, which is going to require a lot of heavy lifting.
So that may employ people who are otherwise displaced.
Yeah, and if I could just add to what Brett said very quickly. So I think we would view AI and KIC as being very compatible in the sense that knowledge will be the frontier that pushes AI and everything else. So it's essential that everything, innovation needs to happen all the time, everywhere for us to progress and advance. And on the creative side, people are going to want to see performers and artists of all kinds, whether it goes from food to visual art to the other fine arts produced. They're going to want to see real human performers. That will remain. People are fundamentally gregarious and like the human connection. So AI won't displace or replace that anytime soon.
Okay, but let me drill into that a little bit, because right now, as we're recording this, there's a demonstration happening in Ottawa, in Canada, and across Canada at the border with the United States, where truckers are objecting to a range of issues, but you can boil them down to, in some respects, what they're resentful that their future is being circumscribed and dictated by other people. They blame it on government, they blame it on regulation, but in some respects, they're also reacting to displacement by technology and artificial intelligence. Anyone who's currently working as a truck driver in North America knows that they don't have a very long future, because already robot trucking is available. It's being tested on roads in the United States right now. And it's just a few years away from becoming reality. And that's a big deal, because what people may not know is that truck drivers are one of the largest independent jobs that's available in the United States. Where will all those displaced truckers go? They're not going to become comedians. They're not going to be entertainers. I don't think they want to become people who are in the creative industry. How do you respond to that, Richard?
I'm very sympathetic to their plight. As a much younger man, I operated heavy machinery for a living for a time. So, I understand how that feels and how that works. But being sympathetic to their plight won't change the outcome for them. The outcome is going to be that automation is going to happen, logistics and supply chains are going to innovate and change, trucking is going to change. And they're either going to have to be retrained to do something else, not to be comedians necessarily, but to work in other meaningful jobs that they hopefully enjoy and get fulfillment from, or they're going to have to change mindset, change industry altogether. It's going to come down to the change is happening. You can either accept it and try and adapt and prepare for the future. And that also is an age variable, right? So if one's close to retirement, there's less of an imperative. If one's in their 30s and they're operating heavy machinery for a living, then that's a greater imperative, I would suggest. It's figure out what else you might like to do and what is derivative of what you're doing now, perhaps, and then tool up and skill up there. And it's incumbent on government and companies and industries to help do that because, look, as a 20-year-old guy operating heavy machinery, I had no idea about much of what was happening in the rest of the world. And I would have needed somebody to tell me that was a limited path and that here, we're going to help you out. We've got some training programs, some ideas, and we're going to sponsor you through that so you don't end up unemployed or redundant to society in some ways in 10 years, 20 years' time. That is something that's absolutely essential. That should be the focus. It's not the focus now for many governments, many policymakers. And for some companies, because if you look at it as a company and the shareholder value return, automation and AI helps. So, where does that leave the employees? Well, that's a secondary question for some, and it can't be and it shouldn't be.
Right. One of the things you'll notice in the US is that truckers are actually voting with their feet. We have a crisis here right now, which is that there aren't enough truck drivers in the United States. And that's partly because for the last 10 years, we've been hearing about robot vehicles. And so young people who hear that say, well, that's a lousy career path. I'm going to choose a different career path. So to some extent, individuals are already making informed decisions. And to give those drivers their due, I think they may be more informed than we sometimes give them credit for. In the closing moments here, I want you to talk a little bit about the bigger vision, optimal humanity, where all this is driving to, all this economic activity, all this technological change, all the prescriptions that you offer. Share with me your vision of optimal humanity.
So this is why I think the Rise of Technosocialism as a book tends to be more a philosophical project rather than, like an economics or policy one in many respects, is, if we extend this out hundreds of years, what do we want from humanity? What's the purpose of us being here? Aristotle, who we quote in the book, said it's for humanity to thrive. And I think the argument we make in the book is that we are entering a period of time where humanity will not have any limitations in terms of what we can do, technologically or scientifically, but that requires us optimally to work together, that for the species, for the planet, for the other species that we share on, the Earth with, and for future generations, there is no downside to humanity working more collaboratively together to produce outcomes that are in the best interests of all humans. Whenever we create division, wherever we have economic classes that produce different outcomes, that's always going to be suboptimal for the human species and for the planet, because you're going to have people game that. So ultimately, that's the philosophical question that we sort of left readers with in the book is, that technosocialism is a path for that type of collectivism, where humanity can work together for better outcomes. And if you say, no, I want my tribe to be the one that gets all the benefits, ultimately at some point that's going to result in someone else having suboptimal outcomes. So we believe that artificial intelligence and climate will force us into that sort of renaissance of thinking as a human species, that optimally humanity is best served by working together. And our fear is that if that epiphany doesn't happen, that the very species is at risk.
Wow, a bold vision, and kind of a stirring call to action, a stirring call to arms as well, folks. This is The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek, and I've been talking to my co-host, Brett King, who is the co-author with our other guest today, Dr. Richard Petty, of the book, The Rise of Technosocialism. It's a stirring read. In my opinion, it's one of Brett's best books. It's really well informed with data. It's rich with factual information. So for each assertion that's made in the book and for each policy prescription that's recommended in the book, you'll find a raft of data to support it. So if you're interested in a fun read with a bright vision of the future, but a realistic take on the challenges that we face as humanity, I really recommend The Rise of Technosocialism. In future episodes, we're going to bring other futurists, other people who are future-minded, to come in and share their methodologies with us. But today, I want to thank Brett and Dr. Richard Petty for sharing their thoughts about The Rise of Technosocialism. Thank you both very, very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
That's it for the Futurists this week. If you like the show, I'm sure you did, please subscribe and share it with those in your community. And please don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. It always helps other people find the podcast. You can also ping us on Twitter and Instagram on @FuturistPodcast for futurists you'd like to see on the show or topics you'd like us to cover. Thanks for joining, and we will see you in the future.